Welcome to the American Hospital Association's webinar for trustees, Time for a New Model of Governance. This session is brought to you by the AHA Trustee Services. Our presenter today is Jamie Orlikoff. Jamie is president of Orlikoff & Associates, Inc., a consulting firm specializing in healthcare governance and leadership, strategy, quality, patient safety, and organizational development. He is the National Advisor on Governance and Leadership to the American Hospital Association. In this session, Jamie examines the trends challenging the traditional governance model and encourages consideration of several foundational questions that can lead to the construction of other models of governance that are relevant to new times. Jamie?
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this webinar where we're going to be looking at governance from a slightly different perspective. And instead of talking about ways of improving governance, we're going to be talking about the current model of governance and whether it's sustainable and what pressures it finds itself under. I start with a very well-known quote from Peter Drucker, who said that even small healthcare institutions are complex, barely manageable places, and that large healthcare institutions such as systems may be the most complex organizations in human history. And adding to that quote, we could say, and they're governed by well-meaning amateurs. In other words, our model of governance really hasn't changed for quite a long time. And so give you a thesis statement, which we've used before, and that is very simply that the quality of governance that was sufficient to get your hospital or system or other type of healthcare organization where it is today will be insufficient to get it where it needs to be tomorrow. And we've talked about the need to continuously improve governance in order to make it relevant to radically and rapidly changing times. But what we're struggling with now is, well, can we improve governance anymore within the context of its current model? Because we've basically had the same model of healthcare governance and nonprofit governance in this country for the past 260 years. Goes back to Ben Franklin and his founding of the nation's first hospital in 1751. And the model, as I'll describe a little bit later on, has been fundamentally unchanged since that time. And so most of the way that we have looked at governance and thought about how to make governance better has been within the context and within the framework of that model. And the thesis I'm going to give you today is that the model itself is showing its age and it's under pressure, and it may well be in the stages of failure. So let's consider that we really might need to think about developing other models of governance in order to carry our healthcare system forward, just as we've developed other delivery models and are considering different financing models. So let's consider this, and let's think about very kind of broadly and in summary, the evolution of governance. And I've kind of divided it into 5 stages. The first stage is what I refer to as the honorific philanthropic model of governance, which goes from the time Ben Franklin founded the nation's first hospital up until about 1965. And from this period, boards really were philanthropic primarily. It was an honor to be on the board. They didn't really perform many functions except for fundraising. And it wasn't until 1965, as a result of malpractice case, a very famous malpractice case, Darling versus Charleston Memorial Community Hospital in Illinois, and the subsequent integration of the ruling in that case into the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services Conditions of Participation in Medicare, which just came into effect then, that we went into the next model. And this was what I call the wink-wink mode of governance. And why do I call it that? It's because technically, legally, the board of a hospital now had responsibilities it didn't have before. Specifically, it was responsible for oversight of the medical staff, for medical staff credentialing, for quality of care, for patient safety, and other things. But even though this was technically and legally a requirement of boards now, the wink-wink was, okay, we'll just still raise funds and it'll still be honorific and philanthropic, and we'll let the docs take care of quality and we'll let management take care of finance and strategy, and we'll keep doing what we've always been doing. In other words, the function of the board was a little bit inconsistent with the legal requirements of governance. This then gave way to what I call stage 3, the good governance mode, and this occurred, say, around 1983, corresponding to the implementation of the prospective payment system and diagnostic-related groups, and kind of the first wave of change that hospitals experienced. They came under financial pressure. We saw the early stages of systems forming and mergers, some hospitals not able to deal with the prospective payment system, and things began to change. And suddenly, the literature began to change, and people began positing the hypothesis that, gee, maybe boards are critical to effective hospitals, and maybe boards need to function differently. Maybe they need to behave in ways which are consistent with what their legal responsibilities are. And so it was during this period, from 1983 to the 1990s, that we began to see kind of the first robust writing and research in governance and how to make governance function better. And this is where we began to see the early kind of seeds of best practices, governance thinking, and so on. And in the 90s, this gave way to stage 4, which I say goes from the early 1990s, say, to 2018, which I call the effective governance mode and also the governance of systems mode. And in the 90s, we saw the first, massive wave of mergers, consolidation. We saw the first kind of wave of hospitals failing. We saw systems forming, and so suddenly we began to think about and research how is system governance different than governing hospitals, and began to learn lessons and began to actually get empirical research that was able to correlate board function with the success of the organization being governed. And this started in the nonprofit higher education world with some of the research by Dick Chait, moved into the for-profit world with research by public pension funds who were interested in maximizing the return on investment, and then came into the healthcare space as we began to study boards. And here's where we began to see the emergence of what was regarded as best governance practices and research which established parameters within which the best boards functioned. And now what I suggest we're entering is stage 5, which is perhaps the next model of governance, where even improving within the current model may be insufficient to carry boards where they need to be to govern health systems in the environment in which they're finding themselves. So let's explore that in a little more detail by going back to consider what were some of the implicit components of the traditional model of healthcare governance. And here's a list of some of the major ones. First of all, it was community-based governance. And this is kind of a really implicit, unwritten, but inviolate rule of governance, which is that governance on behalf of a community necessitates governance exclusively by members of that community. So if you're a hospital in a town of Springfield, only people who live and work in Springfield would be on the board of that hospital in Springfield, as an example. Another implicit component was governance was voluntary. You're donating your time on an uncompensated basis to help govern a nonprofit organization which is contributing to the community. The third was it wasn't going to take a lot of your time. The time commitment would be minimal to manageable, but it wouldn't demand exorbitant amounts of your time. The meetings would be regular, and there wouldn't be a lot of emergency meetings. The work in between meetings wouldn't be that difficult. And in fact, during the 50s and 60s, it was not at all uncommon to have community leaders serve on half a dozen or more nonprofit boards. And this was also replicated in the for-profit space. It was not at all uncommon to find people serving on 10 or 11 Fortune 500 company boards at the same time. And this was all because the expectation was fairly minimal of board member commitment and time. The next implicit component was that there was a lack of any standardized or mandatory training. Board members didn't have to. They were not required to get any training or any certification. And some would avail themselves of opportunities to attend governance education programs, and some wouldn't. Very, very few organizations required that their board members get any training. And this was just the expectation. You kind of learn by doing. The next implicit component was, because of all these themes, very diffuse and variable accountability, both of boards and their members. So when things went wrong in the organization, it was very rare that the board was held to account by regulators, by the federal government, by state attorneys general, and by plaintiffs' attorneys. Because boards were still kind of dealing with the wink-wink model or the honorific philanthropic model, that they didn't really matter and they were just there. It was kind of a benign entity. The next implicit component was long-tenured board members and board leaders. Lack of term limits or lack of age limits for both board members and for board leaders. Not uncommon at all to find people who served as chair for 15, 20 years. Not at all uncommon to find people who served on the board for 20 to 30 years. This was the rule. It was not the exception. And another implicit component was a tolerance of conflicts of interest on the board in service of maintaining community relationships. The notion that there were interlocking relationships. So the banker would be on the hospital board and the hospital would do business with the bank, and it was kind of everybody benefited. And there was even a little notion that this was the quid pro quo. This was, if you're going to volunteer your time, you can get some benefit from it, but it was regarded as acceptable because it helped strengthen the community. So these were some of the basic ones. There were certainly others, and we can explore some of those in additional publications and webinars as we expand on this topic. So what are the pressures that are coming on this model? Why, if this model worked for 260 years, why is it showing its age and why is it beginning to falter? And there are two basic reasons. The first one is, what you're all very familiar with, is the rapidly changing and radically challenging healthcare environment. Healthcare is becoming much more complex. Things are changing very, very quickly. It requires boards to be spending more time and attention. Frequently, you'll have emergency meetings and lots of materials to review. Furthermore, you've got the formation of systems, not just hospital systems, but systems of care which transcend communities. We have multi-state systems. We have multi-billion-dollar systems. So we've got just the healthcare environment, the complexity and the pace of change in the healthcare environment. But secondly, we also have sweeping change in broad societal issues brought about by massive macro forces like changing economics, demographics, culture, and generational forces. And both of these are contributing to this change. So let's consider the first one very briefly. As I alluded to a moment ago, the healthcare market, the pace of change in the healthcare market seems to be constantly accelerating. Furthermore, as we're finding the complexity of healthcare organizations grow as the size, the scale, the scope, not just of big systems, but even of standalone hospitals grows, so does the complexity of governing those systems or those hospitals. So we see that in examples around the country as governance moves to the front page. We've seen the Wall Street Journal take on one of those implicit assumptions of the traditional model, which was they wrote a story about conflicts of interest on hospital boards. And they analyzed every Form 990 from every nonprofit organization in the United States, over 281,000 organizations. And they found that the average conflict of interest rate, someone who was on the board, who did business, with the organization in some way, was about 7%. So 7% of nonprofits in the country have someone on the board who has what would be regarded as a conflict of interest. But what they noticed was for hospitals, that figure was 46%. And that's what attracted their attention, and then they did a story and played it out, and you could read this. But, they were really calling it out. What is it about hospitals, and why do we see these embedded conflicts being much more typical in hospitals? And then they analyzed some of the dynamics of the relationships between hospital board members or physicians and who they did business with. But it's an example of the media beginning to key into what was an accepted and implicit assumption that undergirded the traditional model of governance for so long. At the same time, we began to see percolating into the public consciousness the recognition that hospitals and health systems can be dangerous places, that patient safety is an issue, that the numbers of people who experience medically related patient injury is higher than everyone anticipates, that healthcare is quite dangerous, and there was a growing sense of accountability for that. So who should be held accountable for that type of safety profile or those types of concerns. And as all this happened, what we began to see is that boards that didn't really used to be held accountable suddenly were front and center when things went wrong. So this is an example of an immediate jeopardy letter, an actual letter that went out to a hospital from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services that said your financing from Medicare is in jeopardy, and unless you correct these deficiencies, you will no longer be eligible to receive Medicare reimbursement, which is considered a death sentence because that automatically means you would not be eligible to receive commercial reimbursement, as insurance companies require that you're in good standing with Medicare to be eligible for any type of commercial payment. And as you can see, the very first citation was for the failure of the governing body to fulfill its duties and responsibilities. And in the vast majority of these types of death penalty letters, the number one citation is failure of the governing board to perform its responsibilities. So imagine how this challenges the traditional model of governance. I'm a volunteer in the community. I serve on the hospital board. I do it to help the community. People in the community know I'm on the board, and it's a wonderful relationship. I'm helping the hospital. It's good for the community. The community members think I'm doing good works because I'm on the hospital board, and everybody benefits. And then suddenly in the front page of the local newspaper, it says that the hospital's in deep trouble because the board failed to perform its duties appropriately and responsibly. How now does that change the dynamic that I just described to you? And this is an example of why things are fraying. Now, we could spend the entire webinar just analyzing all the changes and the pressures of these changes on the healthcare governance model, but the argument I will make to you is it's actually the second category of trends, the more broad economic, demographic, cultural, and societal changes, which portend the greatest challenge to the traditional model of governance and probably portend the obsolescence of that model. So let's consider some of those. What are these broader societal changes? So the first one is demographic. Society is aging as the baby boomers get older, and as society ages, and as birth rates decline, and as the ratio of old people to young people expands in a way which is unprecedented historically, the same thing is happening at the level of boards. Boards are growing older, in fact, faster than society is aging. The second major kind of macro trend is the changing economic environment, the 24/7 world in which we live, the gig economy where you have professionals who don't have full-time jobs per se, but rather they have contracts or they have short-term jobs, and therefore they can't make long-term commitments to be at a meeting or a board retreat a year from now because it depends on whether they are free or whether they're under contract or whether they've landed a short-term job somewhere. As all this is happening, as the traditional model of governance comes under pressure, not just in the healthcare environment, but also in the for-profit environment, a new theme is emerging, which is called director distraction. We saw this kind of first with CalPERS, the California Public Employee Pension Investor Service, that in the late 1980s, early 1990s said, you know, it really doesn't make sense that someone could run a business or have a job and serve on 10 boards at the same time and do a good job as a board member. So they said, you know, we're going to have some rules, and we're not going to invest in a company if it has members of its board who serve on more than 3 boards if they're employed or run their own business, or serve on more than 6 boards if they're independently wealthy or retired. And this was the first notion that, you know, there had to be some limit on the amount of board time, on the amount of boards that you serve on, in order to do a good job. Well, now we're beginning to see even those standards challenged, and increasingly we're finding corporations saying, if you're going to be on this board, you can't be on any other boards. As an example, General Electric, which is in a turnaround situation, went to their board members and said, you have a choice. If you're going to remain on the General Electric board, you must resign from any other boards you're on. And if you want to remain on those other boards, then you must resign from the General Electric board. So what this means is that the potential pool of board members, if this grows, this trend grows, is likely to diminish. So let's kind of unpack some of those, you know, as we start to see, oh, I'm sorry, that's a repeat visual, but we're starting to see the accountability grow. We're starting to see the challenges and changes increase the time demands on board members. And so therefore, what we're beginning to see are pushback from board members about the amount of time it's taking. And this is really an interesting challenge and paradox, because the research that we have shows that to be a good board and to have a positive impact on the organization that you're governing takes a lot of time. So as an example, take a look at this research from McKinsey, where they looked at boards of three types of organizations in the for-profit corporate space, what they called high-performing, mid-performing, and low-performing boards, or in their term, very high-impact organizations, moderate or low-impact boards. And what they found was that the boards of the very high-impact organizations, the very high-performing organizations, spent twice as much time governing as did the boards of either the moderate or the low-performing organizations. So it takes time to be an effective board member, and we're seeing this around the country. A different study, this one done by Korn Ferry last year in 2017, showed that the number of hours that board members spend governing publicly traded corporate boards is expanding quite significantly, averaging about 210 hours a year in 2008-2009, and up to about 248 hours a year in 2015-2016. Same thing is true by role. So board chairs are spending much more time than they were lead directors in those companies where the CEO is also the board chair, audit committee chairs, that the time commitment is growing. And we see this not just in our world, but also in general in the for-profit world. Here's a very recent quote from a Forbes article taking a look at what boards of publicly traded companies have to do from August 28, 2018. And the quote is, "The expectations and demands on board members and boards have never been greater. With the rapidly evolving business environment and industry disruption affecting all companies, directors must work hard to stay current, and they must make sure management is up to the task." And that could be, aimed right at health system boards or hospital boards as well. So this is being felt, across the spectrum of governance. And studies that were done by the National Association of Corporate Directors found that, and again, I'm using just the example of for-profit boards here, was that over 50% of board members of publicly traded companies felt that there was not sufficient time for in-depth strategy discussions in their meetings, and that a full 45% of those surveys felt that director education was inadequate and they wanted more time dedicated to learning. And the reason I call this out is that they're expressing these concerns, and these are compensated boards. These are professional board members who are paid significant amounts of money and still are having these challenges. Now let's go back to the healthcare space, because here are the two most common complaints from board members that I'm hearing all around the country when I engage with boards. Number one, just as the for-profit board members were saying, we're not spending enough time as a board in strategic or generative discussions. We're not stepping back and talking about the big picture issues and what our strategy is going to be, or asking the foundational questions that are pre-strategic. And then in the same breath they will say, and governance is taking too much of my time, it's taking more and more of my time, and I'm a volunteer and this is too much. So that's a really interesting kind of paradoxical lament that I'm hearing from nonprofit hospital and health system board members around the country. And here's an example of this. This is a colleague. This was someone I knew who was on a health system board, and she was concerned, and she sent me an email back in 2016, and she said, by way of background, I sit on a number of other boards, and the system board I'm currently on and committees take up as much time as all the other three boards I serve on put together. I am considering early resignation from the board due to this and the fact that I don't feel aligned with the organization. And in fact, she did resign from the board. Now think about that. This was a millennial, female executive, exactly the kind of person who this system wanted, and she resigned from the board. And knowing the system, having worked with them, the time demands that they place on their board members were not excessive compared to other systems. So the question is, well, what is it about health system governance that should require 3 times the time commitment of board members compared to for-profit corporate boards. And a more important question is this time demand on volunteer trustees of hospitals and health systems sustainable going forward? And I would answer that question by saying, no, I don't think it is. So just as I said a little bit earlier, here's a little bit of data from the 2014 AHA governance survey that shows that just like the population, board members are getting older, but faster. And you can see that the number of boards that had any member that was age 50 or younger decreased from 29% in 2005 to 24% in 2011 and only 21% in 2014. And at the same time, the number of boards who had members that were 71 years of age or older increased. And then you can unpack that data a little bit more based on type of organization. And you see that it's really the freestanding hospital boards that are experiencing this, and the system boards are making efforts, at least on the high end. You don't see the population of individuals over 70 as great on the system boards, but none of these really, especially the system boards, have many individuals age 50 or younger. And some other interesting highlights from the AHA survey. As we just showed, board members are getting older. A significant portion, about 40% of boards, do not use competencies or criteria in the selection process for new board members or for board chairs. 80% of boards reported that no board member has been replaced or has not been renominated because of failure to demonstrate needed competencies or because of performance problems. And only slightly more than 50% of boards did a self-assessment in 2014 and did not use these assessment results, those who did, to determine whether boards should be reappointed or not. So this is quite interesting because it shows that even within the current model, that many boards are still not pushing the continuous governance improvement needle to try to make the model work. Now, the compensation issue is an interesting question. Still, the vast majority of boards do not compensate their members, although we're starting to see compensation creep up, especially in large systems, and only about 52% of boards were using electronic board portals to communicate in between meetings and to get their governance agenda materials. So, with that as background, let's consider another kind of more challenging issue, which is generational differences in governance. And around the country, CEOs and chairs of governance committees and board chairs are reporting that it's very difficult to both recruit and to retain millennials to boards. And it raises some question, is there a different commitment to volunteerism among the millennial and Gen X generations? Is the model of governance that we're using completely irrelevant to those generations? Is it just a question of waiting for them to age a little bit and then they'll be happy to serve on boards? Or do they use different approaches to group process, strategic planning, decision-making, use of technology, not just in between board meetings, but during board meetings? And engagement in difficult conversations and tolerance for ambiguity of diffuse decision-making processes. And we're finding that a lot of millennials don't fit with our model, and it raises a very interesting question. Are we going to require that the millennial and Gen X generation will make themselves relevant to our current model of governance? Or are we going to have to change our governance model to make it relevant to the millennial culture and to the changing healthcare environment? And I think it's that second point, which I would say is what we're heading toward. And I'd put it in the form of a question. Can society continue to expect Generation X or millennial professionals or any generation of business executives who are dealing with today's hectic and disruptive environments with family pressures to volunteer what are growing and some claim excessive amounts of time to governing hospitals and systems? Is that implicit concept of the traditional governance model have currency going forward? And I would suggest it does not, and we're going to have to really step back and think about this. I would also suggest that based on many of these trends, it's very likely that the pool of qualified and willing potential hospital and system board members is going to significantly diminish in the near future. And if that happens, as I suggest that it will, we're looking at a future where the only people we'll be able to get to serve on our boards who can volunteer their time are either individuals who are retired, individuals who are independently wealthy, or maybe who have the luxury of working for wonderfully generous employers who give them plenty of time off, or perhaps who own their own businesses and the businesses can run themselves. Or maybe we'll look at a different model where we'll have to put many more insiders on our boards. This is incidentally typical in England in the National Health Service, where a majority of the equivalent of hospital board members are executives, and what we consider trustees they refer to as NEDs, N-E-D, non-executive directors. So we may be looking at some kind of model like that. But meantime, the baby boom, which is currently the primary pool of board members for hospitals and health systems around the country, is aging and cannot be the primary source of board members for too much longer. Now, another concern that I'm hearing board members express is specific to the hospital and health system space, and that is that because of the growing complexity of healthcare, the growing regulation, the growing safety and quality challenges, the antitrust, all of that kind of stuff, board members are increasingly becoming concerned that all of these and other forces are increasing their exposure to liability and reputational risk. That if something goes wrong, just like that example of the immediate jeopardy letter from Medicare that I showed you, that it could blow back on the board member. And people are saying, well, wait a minute now, there are lots of other organizations I can volunteer my time to serve as a board member, none of which have the same risk of reputational damage or legal liability as serving on a hospital board. So why should I serve on the board of a hospital or a healthcare system? So what are the implications of these questions that we're raising and some of the trends that I've been identifying for you? And here's what I think is right in front of us in our windshield. Number one, it's going to become much more challenging to recruit and retain qualified board members. Number two, the average age of boards is likely to continue to increase, and age diversity on boards is going to become a significant issue. And many, many boards are dealing with diversity, but by diversity they talk about racial diversity, ethnic diversity, diversity of thought, gender diversity, but not a lot of boards are pushing the pedal on the notion of age diversity. And I also think generationally, we're going to have some conflict. We're going to have some challenges effectively integrating millennials and Gen X members into the current governance model, and that will be a growing challenge. And for all of these and other reasons, which I haven't had time to get into, I think that the traditional governance model, which has served us very well for 260 years, is likely to fail in the near future. And we have to do something about it. And it's an interesting paradox because board members have been asked many times to redesign the organizations that they are governing. But this is the first time that they will be asked to redesign the models in which they govern. But here's just a couple of strategies, and I know this webinar has raised many questions without giving answers, and it is our intent to give potential new models as possibilities for discussion and consideration in subsequent webinars and white papers. But here are some strategies to deal with these issues. First of all, we've got to make the current model work as long as we can. And what that means is you have got to push to implement all of the known and effective best governance practices strategies in your organization. Streamlining boards, making sure that you're using competency-based selection models, having right-sized boards. Obviously, if it's becoming more difficult to recruit board members, one way of dealing with that is limiting and reducing the number of board positions that you have to recruit to. So being very, very aggressive in streamlining governance, being very, very aggressive in using best practices technique to make the current model last as long as it can and to give us some breathing room while we think about the second strategy, which is we need to begin to consider and experiment with new models of governance. And many of these new models which we'll consider will be antithetical to the principles, implicit or explicit, that undergirded the traditional model of governance. So let me conclude by some questions which your board might want to give some thought to. First, are you seeing any of these trends in your board? Is your board having difficulty recruiting and retaining members compared to 5 or 10 years ago? Is the average age of your board increasing? How many of your board members are age 50 or younger? Are some of your board members expressing concerns about the amount of time that governance is taking? Have you made serious efforts to recruit millennials to the board, and how successful were they? And if you were successful in recruiting them, how effectively do the millennial members of the board fit into the existing culture of governance? And then, how would you, as you think about this issue, what, if any, other strains on the current model of governance is your board experiencing, and what is your plan to address them? So once again, I know that this webinar raised questions without answers, but we wanted to kind of get this on the radar screen and get you thinking about this. And as I said a moment ago, subsequent webinars, white papers, and articles will start positing possible new models of governance for your consideration. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and good luck and good governance.